Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. It is a pleasure to be speaking to you all today on a topic that is very fitting to be spoken of in Istanbul. It is in fact the story of my talk today starts with an article that I wrote that was published in 2019 called "Who Wants the Caliphate?" It was published in the United States. But before I published that article, as I was in the process of writing it, I came to Istanbul and spoke to a program that was also, in fact, organized by Dr. Ahmed, where he kindly allowed me to speak on that topic. And so this is where I first tried out my argument, which at the time, thinking of the idea of the caliphate in the West is not something that one typically does. It's not easy. And being in Istanbul and talking to people, in fact, the room in which I was talking to had people from 20 different nationalities, and that was really fascinating and wonderful for me to present my argument. So why that argument? Why? Who wants the caliphate? Why talk about the caliphate? So let me first begin by cutting a good part of my talk where I argue about the importance of Muslim unity. Not everybody will agree with that point, but in this conference, I have seen over the last 3 days that there is a convergence on one point, that Muslims are not doing well and that Muslims need to be united and that there is an urgency. So because of that convergence and agreement, I'm going to go right into the question that raises, if you will, more disagreement, which is what form should that unity take? The argument that I make in my article is that the caliphate is an obligation in Muslim tradition without any disagreement among Orthodox Muslim scholars, whether they are Sunni or even if they are Shia or Ibadis, for example. In different forms, they agree on the basic idea. This is one of the things that Muslim tradition has come to a consensus on. So I argue one part that it is an agreed upon obligation. But secondly, I argue that it is a necessity to solve many of the problems that Muslims are facing today. And that is most of my talk today. And the third argument that I make is that it is a feasible idea, that we can do it. That's also something that I will talk about. So first, why call it the caliphate? After 9/11, 2001, and global war on terror, the United States, the country where I live, where I'm a citizen of, and where I write, took it, in fact, as its mission to redefine the contours of Islam, and part of that redefinition of Islam included defining who is a good Muslim and who is a bad Muslim. And part of that conversation was that people who, there were good Muslims who were perhaps Sufi or and maybe modernized and not concerned with hard and fast rules, not concerned with Muslim unity, and bad Muslims were all the other ones. That included the Salafis, it included Islamists, it included the Obandis, it included Taliban. But In the process, certain key Islamic concepts and words such as jihad, such as the Sharia, and such as the Khilafah became bad words. And of course, I do not need to repeat the history of United States and US imperialism in the Muslim world. The two Gulf Wars in particular, in Iraq and the second, of course, and then in Afghanistan first, and then in Iraq. And that led to the rise of a terrorist outfit called ISIS or Daesh, which used the term Khilafah and made it an extremely difficult word to use, so much so that one simple way to put it is that, a new kind of a license was now given as a result of this new discourse to all the rulers around the world that you can do whatever you need to do to take care of your Muslim problem. This included Israel or India or Myanmar or China, but also it included the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the rest of these autocracies that used their Muslim problem or used this war on terror to redefine their role. A new social contract was, if you will, a new social contract was authored to effectively say to the West, we will give you the silence of our populations in return for your support for our rule. Now, it is in this context that it became increasingly difficult to talk about Islam on its own terms. And it is also in this context when a terrorist outfit with dubious origins like ISIS, when it uses the word caliphate, Muslims become terrified of using words that are central to our tradition, that are in the Quran, that are in the Sunnah, that are in the Hadith, that are throughout our tradition. And so that is why I found it extremely important to write about Muslim unity in terms that are authentic, terms that are indigenous, while also recognizing the difficulty. In fact, precisely because I think it was important to wrestle that word back from the likes of Daesh and Al-Qaeda and so on, that I used that term in that article. And of course, what I was surprised by is the response of both Muslim and non-Muslim intellectuals, not to mention other Muslims at large, who found that almost a major sea change in how you can talk about Islam. If you can talk about the caliphate in the United States, can you now really express yourself? And I think so that was a change. But at the same time, I want to also challenge some of the ways in which the word caliphate is used by many Muslims that is ahistorical. So in that article, I present, for example, at least 4 or 5 different ways in which the caliphate was institutionalized or embodied. There is the early Rashidun Caliphate, there is the imperial caliphate of the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and then there is the more symbolic caliphate of late Abbasids, and then a different kind of caliphate that re-emerges with the Ottomans. In these various institutional formations, the caliphate was not one thing. So normally when people think of the caliphate, they think of one absolutist kind of medieval ruler who has all the power. But I argue that that, in fact, is not the essence of the caliphate. And in fact, in most cases, the caliphal power was not absolute. But that aside, the question now is, whatever the caliphate is, the Ummah must be at the center of the discourse. That is why the institute that we established in response to my article and the response to the article, called the Ummatics Institute. It's not called caliphate, but Ummatics, precisely because the Ummah has to be at the center. And I argue also in my book and my articles that I've written before that Islamic political discourse should be critiqued. Medieval Islamic political discourse, pre-modern Islamic political discourse, which is, I argue, is important for us to continue and engage with and revere, yet also to critique. And I argue that the starting point of our political, our future caliphate, our future unity must be the Ummah and not the person of the caliph. So that said, what are the challenges to the idea of ummatic unity? There are external challenges, obviously, and internal challenges, and we often talk about external challenges. We often talk about Israel will never let this happen, or the United States will never let this happen, but I think that those are really irrelevant challenges. At the end of the day, the real challenges that we must attend to are internal. So what are those internal challenges? There are some conceptual changes that I think are necessary, a reformation of sorts. One is a sense of learned helplessness of the Ummah, a sense that we cannot become united, that we as Muslims are almost an exception to history, exception in how incapable, incapacitated we are. I remember when I talk about this idea, and I was talking to a very high-ranking cleric, a scholar, and I mentioned to him about the idea of ummatic unity. He said, brother, this is impossible. And so then I changed the conversation. I talked to him about colonizing Mars and how Elon Musk has announced that, by 2030, we will colonize Mars. And this is also announced on NASA website. This is the United States government's goal to colonize Mars. And I asked him, do you think that is feasible? He said, why not? So I said that you are telling me that for Muslims to do what almost everybody else has done, the European Union fought 2 world wars and after that came together for economic and cultural benefit, and you're saying that it is impossible for you to imagine that Muslims can be united. So he almost backtracked and realized what he was saying. So there is of course, I think a result of war on terror and other things. That's our biggest challenge. Second, of course, there's theological forms of defeatism and messianism, end times, and sectarianism in which is part of our challenge. Third, there is an internalized Orientalism by which we think of history as a glass ceiling. So if something did not happen in history, then it cannot happen in the future. But everything that we are doing, in fact, the entire world has done things that were historically considered inconceivable, including the fact that we are talking here today in the English language, and Muslims from so many different backgrounds can speak to each other, can travel. This has never been possible in history. So we are already doing many things, including the simultaneous translation that is going on, that are things that were unthinkable until very recently. But it is the practical challenges that I want to draw your attention to, and that is what the Ummatics Institute is for. How much time do I have left? Sorry, I did not keep my own time. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, okay. Okay, very good. So the practical challenges, I will mention 4 areas that the Ummatics Institute is working recognizing that these are our primary challenges. Number one is the question of what we call managing deep differences among Muslims. Muslims have deep differences. They are sectarian differences, Shia, Sunni, Sufi, Salafi, Hanafi, Shafi'i, and so on and so forth. Then there are ethnic differences, Turk, Kurd, or Arabs and Persians, and so on and so forth. These are all differences, and the question is that we need a scientific approach to studying the history and management of these differences. So when we go to Islamic seminary or even a normal place of education for Muslims, there should be a subject where we look at Muslim differences and learn skills and learn knowledge that is necessary to manage those differences. Number two, there is the question of economic integration. Currently, the trade between Muslim countries is extremely low. One number that I was told is as low as 3% of our total trade is with other Muslims. There are, of course, a number of very interesting initiatives on Islamic economics and economic integration that we are working with. Number three, I think there is one of the major challenges is our research in science and technology is extremely limited. And in part, it's not so much a matter in this case of lack of freedom, which of course ails nearly all Muslim societies, but also a sense of a lack of civilizational motivation and ethics that are necessary for research. And I think that political illegitimacy and instability play a major role in that. And then there is a question of forms of political unification. Should it look like European Union or the United States or some other form of integration? We need to invest in modern institutional design so that Muslims from all different backgrounds and despite, given their diversity, can find a way to work together. Obviously, a lot of what I have said sounds like science fiction, but at the same time, I believe that it is important for us to have that vision. Many things, that we thought were impossible today, in one lifetime, they have become possible. And I believe that the unity of Muslims in a form that is pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and one that will be able to protect and prevent Muslims against genocides and massacres and otherwise the prisons of the dungeons of Syria that we have seen, it is a necessity that we need to dream big and work for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Anjum. I'm going to give a second chance. And now our next panelist speaker is Cemil Aydın. Cemil Aydın is the professor of global history at North Carolina University. And he has a book, The Idea of Muslim World, is a famous world book, and translated to Turkish. Cemil Hocam, Ovamir Anjum says there is no one type of caliphate in the history, but there was a caliphate always in a different sense. Maybe you are a historian, you can draw some historical perspective of the caliphate issue, and you will have also 15 minutes for first round, and then we will continue second round.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Ahmed, for inviting me. So for the sake of the time, as a historian, I want to maybe highlight the main points. I would agree that caliphate was abolished at the peak of its popularity. The Ottoman Caliphate, March 2nd, 1924. This has happened in the context of the end of the Ottoman Empire. We are in the 100-year anniversary of that moment within this year. And caliphate meant a very progressive, positive, humanist Muslim internationalism, Muslim unity at the time of European colonialism. However, I would like to historicize this moment. I try to highlight why, first time in history since the time of the Prophet Muhammad, miraculously, many Muslims from Indonesia, China, Philippines to Europe and Africa agreed on a concept of a caliphate, agree on their respect for the Ottoman Caliphate. I want to argue that this was a unique moment from 1870s to 1924. 1924 decision didn't have to happen. There could still have been a caliph living in Dolmabahce Palace today, but this decision was made for various reasons. But looking back after 100 years, any talk of creating Muslim unity by a caliph will be counterproductive. I think that era is over. In fact, I will argue that in order to achieve some sort of Muslim solidarity, unity is always impossible, some Muslim cooperation to solve the common problems, including genocide, we should think differently, focus on the goal, but not the means. The caliphate was a mean in the late Ottoman Empire to achieve a purpose. It achieved some of the purposes. We need to understand what that purpose was. And in that sense, I think we should declare the end of the era of caliphate, because any attempt of creating Muslim unity through a caliphate will be very divisive, unnecessary. It's not true that all Muslims agree on a caliphate. I don't have to tell this audience about the Shia Muslims or Ismailis or even different Sunni branches. So my point is the following, maybe to summarize in a short. As a historian, first to highlight, and I'm going to come to this spot again, Muslims were never politically united. This wasn't necessary in order to be Muslims. Muslim societies after the time of Prophet Muhammad were ruled by different empires. In fact, that division of Muslim societies were more important, more natural after the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. But the caliphate that was ended in the Abbasid period was also very different than the caliphate of Hazreti Abu Bakr. Second, Muslims always were creative in creating political institutions. I highly recommend, not of Turkish nationalism, because I now advocate that we should forget about the Ottoman Caliphate, but if I am a Turkish nationalist, I'm very proud of these two brilliant scholars. One of them is Professor Hayrettin Yücesoy, who wrote about the caliphate in Abbasid period, and he argued that actually during the period of the Abbasid Empire, there was a very sophisticated Muslim political theory around the notion of siyasa. That Muslim scholars already went beyond the early juridical ideas of the caliphate. So this is one good example that not only that there were Muslims outside of the Abbasid Caliphate, like in Andalus, but Muslims always had much more complex ideas of caliphate. Second scholar, Professor Hüseyin Yılmaz, wrote about the Ottoman Caliphate. And this is a question that the Ottoman Empire was not the Muslim world. Muslims were never united under Ottoman rule. Süleyman the Magnificent did not try to unite them. And the titles of sovereignty, political titles of Muslims, Muslim kings were Shah, Padishah, which was according to actually juridical theory, it's shirk. You cannot say someone is Shah or Shah, you have to be Caliph. Or Hakan, that's inherited from Genghis Khan. At the peak of the Caliphate movement, Abdülhamid was always praised as Abdülhamid Han Hakan in the Indian Muslim literature too. What Hüseyin Yılmaz shows that, yes, there is a notion of caliphate at the time of Kanuni Sultan Süleyman, but this is more of a mystical caliphate, an emperor who has some sort of a sacred mission to create peace and order in the universe, but to highlight the caliphate was not a political sovereign title. You do not rule a place as a caliph, and I will explain what then the caliphate does. So why did caliphate came? And because it's shorter, I need to highlight one important position. The Ottoman Empire was an empire. It had until 1517, until it conquered Egypt, actually have almost half Christian, half Muslim population. And after 15, Ottoman sultans did not use caliphate title consistently. There were people who claimed to be caliph in Morocco and other places, and the majority of the Muslims lived outside of the Ottoman Empire. So why did then suddenly, miraculously, there is a global Umma consensus about the spiritual caliphate of the Ottoman Sultan? This happened gradually in the 19th century, and it has something to do with that problem of colonialism and racism. Muslims were colonized across the world. Some of the big empires, like the Mughal Empire, the Babur Empire, was collapsed. And it's in that context, Muslim societies were trying to solve, they need a unity like Palestine, unity for Palestine, solve their problems. And what these problems are: humiliation, racism, discrimination, exploitation, division. If you're an Indian Muslim, you went through hell of a British rule, or if you're an Algerian or Indonesian Muslim, you're facing Dutch rule. It's in that context that the very fact that there is a modern monarch in Istanbul who is part of a European club of empires. Ottoman Empire was a member of the European Club of Empires, who was Sultan, Padishah, and Hakan, but at the same time also a caliph ruling over Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, and Najaf, became very important as a means for Muslim societies to achieve a goal. And these goals were equal rights, freedom and emancipation, equality in a global context. So ironically, Muslims were more united, and which in the late 19th century than ever. We see this as a good example is that the Shia Muslims began to support or sympathize with the Ottoman Caliphate. If you ever go to Karbala, Imams will tell you that during World War I, Shia Muslims supported the call for jihad by the Ottoman Caliph because they were also ruled by the Ottomans. But I should remind some of the leading pan-Islamic intellectuals. Jamaluddin Afghani was Shiite. Sayyid Emir Ali was also Shiite. The person who actually wrote a letter to Ankara not to abolish the caliphate was Aga Khan himself, who wasn't even supposed to believe in a caliph because he was Ismaili. And Shekib Arslan was from a Druze family. He was actually the father-in-law of the current leader of the Druze. So why did all these people wanted Ottoman caliphate? Misconception, what is wrong, is that we think that there was an Islamic world led by the Ottoman Caliph, and that Islamic Ottoman Caliph defended the Islamic world against Europe. Islam versus Europe. This is a clash of civilization thesis. That never happened. The reason why Ottoman Caliph became so important is that it's precisely because he was a member of the European imperial order. There was no Islamic international order at the time of Sultan Abdulhamid or Sultan Abdulaziz. But this caliphate was very important because Muslims were racialized. They were subjected to renans and Gladstones and other form of racism, the Dutch racism. These were institutionalized racism. And why was Ottomans important in this context when we see the Ottoman Sultan Abdulaziz with the French emperor with a fez, and this is the opening ceremony of the Suez Canal. You are an empire in Europe, but then caliphate becomes important because he becomes the wakil, the leader of this brown race of Hindus and Muslims. This is the age of empire, but also racism, yellow race and black race. And the caliphate achieved a lot for Indian Muslims and African Muslims. It allowed them to talk back against European racism because Ottoman Caliph was the Caliph of the Tanzimat. It already reconciled every aspect of modern governance, of a civilized government, and it responded all the accusations. It was a good medium to respond all the accusations against European claim that the Muslims are uncivilized. I want to give you one example. This is Shibli Numani, who came to Istanbul in 1890. And he's a big admirer of the Ottoman Caliphate. The first book that he wanted to be translated, the biggest person that he admired was Fatma Ali Hanım, who wrote Nisvan Islam, and he allowed it to be translated into Urdu then Arabic. When you read his memoirs, he's very proud that Ottoman Sultan is more civilized, more democratic, more tolerant than the British Emperor. And Indian Muslims had a list of Christian bureaucrats in the Ottoman Empire, ministers and ambassadors. Indians knew that. And then they will consistently say that our caliph is more civilized than the British Emperor, which they weren't against. And because they will say, where are the Muslims and Hindus in your government? In some ways, then, for Muslims outside of the Ottoman Empire, caliphate represented tolerance, good governance, and the modernity and civilized, progressive nature of the Muslim societies, including the question of women's rights. And I want to highlight one aspect. One of the most forgotten aspects of the global Muslim public opinion is the attention to international law. Muslims know that the Ottoman Empire was a strong empire, but it did not have enough military power to defend the Ummah. Russian Empire was much stronger. As a result, then Muslims highlighted the importance of international law. Those Turkish audience who watched Payitah Abdülhamit, there's always an image of Abdülhamit as someone who's slapping the British ambassador, which is not true. But they forget that the Abdülhamit foreign ministry is one of the first foreign ministries in the world who instituted international law to solve the problem of international inequality and order. And in that sense, I find South African foreign minister who's a Muslim, remember the Naledi Pandor, who started the case against Israel in the International Criminal Court. I think she's a good representative of that Ottoman Muslim internationalism, using international law to create justice for Muslims. And it's in that context, we also see that some of the Ottoman symbols like crescent and the fez is adopted by all the Muslims around the world as a symbol of pride, as a symbol of cultural unity of values. These values are equality and justice. And if I were young, I would have done a dissertation on the history of the fez, which is a great topic. So what I'm trying to get at is that before caliphate was established, this is too much just for me to what I was arguing, that we establish a system where Ottoman caliph emerges what we call the spiritual sovereign of all Muslims in the world, not a political sovereign. But here I see also a brilliant Muslim Indian anti-colonial strategy. What they do with this notion of a spiritual sovereignty, which sounds like you're deviating from juridical law, because according to Islamic law, there is no spiritual sovereignty. What they're telling to the British or the French and the Dutch is that, yes, you may be ruling my empire, but I am not alone. You cannot oppress me. I have someone in Istanbul who can speak on my behalf, who can articulate my rights, my emotions, and the injustices in the world. And the spiritual political division, mezhebi or versus siyasi, becomes a good strategy because British always claimed that we are not against Islam. Muslims have full religious freedom. And it becomes very smart for Indian Muslims to say, if I have a religious freedom, I will follow my caliph in Istanbul because it's my religious duty. But Brits will go insane about this. They say, what do you mean by another empire's ruler is your spiritual sovereign? How many minutes? 1 minute, very good. So what I'm trying to get at is that even after this moment, which we will discuss, came as a result of the success of the caliphate movement. And there are two actors. We, in this Turkey, we owe Lausanne to the idea of caliphate, two actors, the Indian Khilafat movement, probably Ovamir's grandparents donated money and gold. And the second one is the Enver Pasha, Jamal Pasha, Talat Pasha. They created a kind of Islamic internationalism after World War I. As a historian, I should say that everything you attribute to Abdülhamid today is actually Enver Pasha and Jamal Pasha, not Abdülhamid himself. But at the peak of his power, his achievement that created Lausanne, Turkish government decided to abolish the caliphate for various reasons. I'm not going into the detail on this. But I want to go into, in my last minute, so why did the caliphate come back? For about 50 years after the failed congresses, it's forgotten. Muslims struggle for justice, for liberation, but they think that they could do this without the caliphate because there's no way to recreate this magical formula of the Ottoman Caliphate. A caliph, which is Hakan, Padishah, but a member of European club, which is also ruler of Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem. One thing I want to highlight about the legacy of the spiritual caliphate is that after caliphate was abolished, all the Muslim rulers wanted to marry the daughters of the caliph, but no one said, I want to marry the son and make him a king. We should also think about the femininity of the idea of caliph. These are the Ottoman caliph's daughters or nieces who married the richest Indian Raja, who was very loyal to the British, the Nizam of Hyderabad. But my summary for this is that it's hard to recreate the caliphate, so why did it come back? It came back also through the Palestine question. Where's my slide on Palestine? Because the purpose of Muslim internationalism was emancipation, hurriyat, as the Syrians today wanted and achieved, mashallah, last week. But there were places that we haven't achieved that emancipation, and Palestine became one of them. And for a long period of time, Palestinians used every strategy possible, including socialist internationalism. You see Haji Emil al-Husseini meeting with the Chinese communist leader. And I think after the great crisis of the turning point in the 70s, that we couldn't liberate Palestine, then there was this new call for Muslim internationalism, as a result of which some people call for a revival of caliphate. But if you actually think about what that goal was, then we might achieve it with other means without recreating the sectarian, divisive nature of the caliphate that might be too late to revive at this point. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Cemil Hocam. Is it okay? Now, Ovamir Hocam, you will have 8 to 10 minutes. Okay. You will continue with your arguments or to respond some Cemil Hocam's arguments. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Aydın. Okay. So I wish I could go into all of the examples he gave, because I do admire the depth of historical knowledge, and we can talk about the interpretation. So to be very quick, because I want to give Professor Aydın a chance to respond and to hear from you all. Number one, think about it. All of the examples that he gave are kind of like saying, go to Tatarstan, go to India, and talk to a guy on the street. Do they pray? No, they don't pray 5 times a day. Therefore, you don't have to pray. In fact, prayer is not part of Islam at all. So the method of argument that's made is non sequitur, meaning that just because the reasons why in the 19th century the idea of caliphate became important had some benefits, and those benefits were the reason why they were trying to do it, and therefore we should not do it, or that we should try to figure out, the benefits of praying. For example, it makes you, it makes you spiritually more alert. It brings you closer to God. And instead, we could do yoga or something else. The point is that while all the examples that Professor Aydın gave are valid and interesting, they just don't speak to the point. What is the point? Number one, the point that I have made is that it is seen by Muslims as an obligation. That's number one. how do Muslims determine an obligation, how they have done so. Now, we may disagree it's an obligation today. Modernist Muslims disagree with a lot of things. But Muslims did not disagree on this point. Muslims disagreed about every possible point, not on this point. For centuries and centuries, you can look at each of the different madhahib in law and theology in different centuries. They are repeating the same thing. They agree on that one thing. So that's one point. Second, I'll give you 3 stories really quickly. The first response to the Crusaders was not Salahuddin. It was not even Nuruddin. The very first person to respond to the Crusaders, only a decade or so after the Crusaders came in the year 1099 of Common Era, was a man by the name of Ibn al-Khashab, who is a scholar and a qadi of Aleppo. And he wants to start fighting back, make jihad. The ruler of the time of Aleppo does not agree, so Ibn al-Khashab goes to Baghdad, to the Abbasid Caliph, who is very weak at the time, and asks for help. And the Caliph is not able to help, so Ibn al-Khashab comes back and raises an army or leads an army and starts jihad for the first time, in fact, and is able to have a victory for, even though it's small. Ibn al-Khashab was not a Sunni, he's a 12er Shi'i. So the idea that Shia-Sunni unity or Shia recognition of a Khilafah is a new idea that the Ottomans invented is not correct. Number 2, in the 14th, 15th centuries, India, the Delhi Sultanate, at that time you have the Abbasid Caliph in Cairo, who is only nominally a caliph, but because Muslims believe that it is an obligation, as soon as a king, whether it's a Malik or Shah or Shahin Shah, as soon as they become religious, they ask themselves, who is the Khalifa? And they ask for a letter of investiture from the Khalifa. Final story, in the beginning of the 16th century, in Aceh, Indonesia, the king has recently become a Muslim and is facing competition from other local kings. So he sends an embassy to the Caliph Suleiman, in fact, at the time, and asks for help. Suleiman Qanuni does actually, or the Ottomans do send help back. It arrives in the form of ships, which allows, it teaches technology, not only weapons, but technology of cannon making. The problem is that it takes nearly 20 years for this back and forth to take place. But once the technology gets there, it kind of empowers that ruler of Aceh, the Muslim ruler of Aceh, who recognizes the Ottomans as his caliphs and asks for help. But if it takes you 15, 20, 30 years to communicate and get reasonable help, that means you have to make it out on your own. All of these examples show that Muslims from different parts, different centuries, recognize the idea of a caliphate. That includes even the Shia, and that it was not often practical because of long distances for one ruler to in fact affirm or assert their sovereignty. When the Safavids came to power, that's one of the reasons some historians speculate they chose 12er Shi'ism and not Sunni Islam is because they were afraid that if they chose Sunni Islam, they would have to give their allegiance to the Ottoman Caliph. Now this is a dubious perhaps interpretation. I'm not an expert on Safavids, but the point is that that idea is in fact alive throughout. So the point that I'm making is you can look throughout Islamic history and find 3 things. Number one, did Muslims believe in a caliph? We're only talking about religious believing Muslims because that's the basis of the argument. The answer is yes. Number two, did they actually try to achieve that kind of collaboration and coordination? The idea of political unity, the way we think of in the modern world with a single state and administration, did not exist. So that's not what we are talking about. These things took different forms. But did they try to achieve political solidarity of the time that was relevant? And the answer to that is yes. The third question is, did they succeed in doing so? And the answer to that is, well, they succeeded not as, it was probably they succeeded as much as Muslims succeed in telling the truth or praying 5 times a day. Meaning, not always. So, the final point I want to make is think about the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him. How many of us believe that Muslims should emulate his example, should try to be like him? You all agree? I'm assuming if you understood what I'm saying, you all raise your hand. We all want to be like the Prophet, peace be upon him. How many of us, in fact, claim that at some point in our lives, we can be like the Prophet? We can be exactly like the Prophet. We'll reach that status and ethics and morality. None of us. In other words, we believe in a form of morality that we know we cannot achieve. Right? So believing, in fact, that precisely is what makes it worth achieving. Muslim unity is precisely that kind of ideal. There will always be differences, but just as piety and good morality is something that we seek, and we seek as part of our religion and part of foundation of our social and political existence, in the same way that people who talk about democracy are constantly asking and saying, well, we don't have democracy today. Democracy is corrupted. Big money has come and taken it. Or the nationalists are taking democracy. So democracy is always incomplete. It's always fugitive. There is, in fact, a term that political theorists use, fugitive democracy, because it appears only very now and then. And yet you live by this notion of democracy. That's how political ideals are. So I think that Professor Aydın is applying different kinds of criteria to answer that question than we ought to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cemil Hocam. Now, it's your turn, Cemil Hocam.
As I understand your argument is that the theory was never applied since the time of Prophet Muhammad, with some exceptions. But it doesn't mean that it could be applied. You're right that American political science departments are like madrasas. As we teach caliphate theory in madrasas, they teach democracy theory, which never applies to reality, but they still teach it. Here are my 2 major concerns about this, to be brief. One, actually, Muslims do not agree on the caliphate. That's not true. Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims are Muslims, Ismaili Muslims are Muslims. And even among the Sunni Muslims, there are opinion differences. Muslims are not a member of a small tribe as a family. Every person who has a family who knows that you cannot even have a caliph within a family. The kids don't agree. Nobody listens to the father. It's a very old political model. It's not in the Quran. It was decided on the spot after Prophet Muhammad died. I don't see caliphate as a religious obligation or a truth. Yes, some Sunni Muslims think that the caliphate is part of the faith, which is not true, which was never applied. So I think that argument that in order to be a true good Muslim, you have to believe in caliphate is not accurate, which also I never thought that it was your argument, because I read your piece before this panel. It's more sophisticated, so you're also doing injustice to your argument. But let me get to the sophisticated part of your argument, was that international ordering is in crisis. The promised European universalism and enlightenment was never delivered. There are too many injustices in the world, and you argued that if the European ideas are not saving us, we need to go back to the authentic Islamic ideas to decolonize the world and to bring peace and justice. with that second argument, what I'm worried is this, is that if you put the bar too high to say that I only solve this problem if Muslims become truly believing Muslims, and there are 1.5 billion of them, and then we can solve the problem. And if we have the real good faith and we can unite the Muslims around caliphate, we can liberate the Palestine. This moment will never come. That actually becomes impediment to achieve your goal. I cannot tell the Palestinians that, brothers, I'm sorry, the world failed you, Umma failed you, United Nations failed you, and in order to liberate you, wait for me, I'm going to go around and create the caliphate. That would be an unfair question to those people. Meaning that the idea of a Muslim unity now became so apolitical, it becomes very self-destructive, very divisive. And we also cannot forget what was done in the Middle East in the name of the caliphate, and what was done in Asia in the name of the caliphate, or in other places, that the Muslims live in states, they have obligations to do with states. So I do think that it's better to think about Muslims as like any other human being who believe they have values. In order to achieve their values, they need to work, they need to do politics, they need to create solidarity. So the biggest pan-Islamists who are very effective for me, Abdul Rashid Ibrahim, who is a great traveler in Korea and Japan, he talked to Chinese, he talked to the Indians and the Japanese. He said that we are not the only people who are oppressed, we need to have a solidarity. With the South African struggle, if we thought that apartheid will end only if all the black people in the world unite and they create the black caliphate, then South Africa will be free, we would have waited much longer. They did something more. And on that front, I think the actual experience is much richer than we give credit to. Let me give one example then, and I also don't want to talk only about Turks in Istanbul. I lived in Malaysia for a year, so I knew about the man named Tunku Abdul Razak, who is one of the first prime minister of Malaysia. A Muslim in his own way, he's a prince, but what he did is amazing. When I read a dissertation recently on his achievement, because he's the first Secretary General of the Organization of Islamic Conference. He knows that Malaysia will be free, but he then that takes that freedom first to British Commonwealth, so that's not the only community. Within the British Commonwealth, he fights against South Africa's discrimination of Muslims and Africans, and together they kick South Africa out of British Commonwealth. Then he works to kick South Africa out of United Nations. We need some notion of Muslim internationalism who can work like him to kick Israel out of the United Nations. We don't need to wait for the Ummah to be united under whoever that caliph be. And finally, he thinks that, again, in the new world order, we need a Muslim unity, so he became the champion of the Organization of Islamic Conference. So Muslims should always act on their belief, fight for faith, taqwa, justice, tawheed, but caliphate was a tool, useful. It's no longer serve that purpose. We need to think differently in order to achieve our goals of justice and freedom.
Merhabalar, ben Doktor Abdurrahim Şen. Konuyla İslami yönetim siyaset konularıyla yakından ilgiliyim. Sorum Anjum Bey'e. Malumunuz Zbigniew Brzezinski, Amerikan Ulusal Strateji Dairesi Başkanlığı yapmıştı uzun yıllar. Büyük Satranç Tahtası adlı kitabında 21. yüzyılda Amerika'nın süper güç olduğu, 21. yüzyılda da bu süper güç olasılığını tartışıyor tamamen. Belli bir takım senaryolar kuruyor. 4-5 tane seçenek sunuyor. Amerika'nın dışında 21. yüzyılda süper güç olma ihtimali söz konusu olan seçenekler. Bu seçeneklerden birisi de Orta Doğu'dan ortaya çıkacak ve bütün İslam dünyasını tek bir siyasi çatı altında birleştirecek bir İslam devletinin Amerika'nın 21. yüzyıl hayallerini tamamen suya düşüreceğini ifade ediyor. Şimdi son 10 yılda Orta Doğu coğrafyasında büyük bir Arap Baharı halk ayaklanmalarına tanık olduk. Özellikle Suriye'de eski CIA Başkanı Michael Hayden'ın bir Suriye ile ilgili bir değerlendirmesi benim dikkatimi çekti. Diyor ki Amerika için en iyi seçenek Esed'in ayakta kalmasıdır. Eğer Esed devrilirse bütün bölge 1916'da Sykes-Picot Antlaşması'nın çizdiği bütün bu harita yeniden çizilir. Ve Levant, Ürdün, Filistin, Lübnan, Suriye ve Türkiye'nin de belli bir bölümünü içine alan, uluslararası siyaset literatüründe bu bölgeyi ifade eden bu kavramı kullanarak diyor ki bu kelimenin tam anlamıyla Levant'ın patlamasıdır ve dünyanın merkezinde yönetilemeyen bir alanın oluşması anlamına gelir diyor Amerika açısından. Diğer bir bizzat devrik
Abdurrahim Bey, çok kısa
soruya
yapalım
geleceğim.
çünkü uzuyor.
Tamam,
Hızlıca soruya
hemen
geçebilirsek.
bağlıyorum.
Evet.
Esed'e sorulan benzer bir soruya ben laikliğin son kalesiyim, fay hattı üzerindeyim. Burada bir kırılma yaşanırsa Fas'tan Endonezya'ya kadar yeni bir jeopolitik dünya kurulur dedi. Bizzat Esed'in kendisi. Şimdi ben Anjum Bey'e şunu sormak istiyorum. Aslında İslam dünyasında aydınlarımız, münevverlerimiz, ilgili olanlar bu konuyu takip ediyorlar. Batı'da bizzat bu endişeler tartışılırken İslam dünyasının kamuoyunun genelinden saklanan bu öngörüler. Batılılar bu konuda çok ciddi öngörülerde bulunurken İslam dünyasında bizim aydın ve münevverlerimizin, sizin az önce de Elon Musk örneğiyle atıf yaparak neden bunun bir gerçeklik, artık tarihi bir gerçeklik olduğu konusunda hala kuşkuları var. Teşekkür ediyorum. Soruyu şöyle soruyorum. Batı'da
Yine sentence, could you...
Sorum şu şekilde. Batı'da ciddi anlamda bu anlamda bir öngörü var. Ancak İslam dünyasında entelektüel dünya maalesef bunu bir zaman, yani gerçeklik olarak hala görmüyor. Bunun nedenleri nedir?
So I take, if I understand your question correctly, I am sympathetic to it. I think that Muslims are not fully appreciative of the potential that we have. And it's a challenge of our, it's internalized Orientalism of sorts, I think, that we need to address. We need our institutions and intellectuals who are able to think broadly. I think that Muslims don't do futurology. We don't think big about our future. I think that's important to do. I hope that answers your question.
Şanlıurfa'dan Çetin Gören, hocalarım ağzınıza sağlık. Bir sorum Cemil Hocam'a, bir soru da Anjum Hoca olacak. Cemil Hocam, şu anda eğer gerçek bir halife devam etseydi, biz yine ve Filistin bu halde olsaydı, şu anki çocuk, kadın ölümlerini falan söylemeye gerek yok, her gün yüreğimiz yanıyor. Biz yine ya işte Filistinler kusura bakmayın, biz size yardım edemiyoruz. İşte ümmet birleşmedi, işte biz bir araya gelemedik, kusura bakmayın öyle mi diyecektik? Hocama da bir sorum. Gerçekten şu anda devam eden, hakkaniyetli devam eden bir halife olsaydı yine emperyalistler burada istediği gibi at koşturabilir miydi? Veyahut da yine Filistin'de kurulan o çıban ülkesi kurulabilir miydi ve bu kadar pervasız olabilir miydi? Teşekkür ederim.
Hi, Bilal Salam, Istanbul Ticaret University English lecturer, Ibn Haldun PhD sociology student. This question is for Professor Aydın. I appreciate what I'm hearing to be like an almost non-materialist or idealist interpretation of how the caliphate can be. My dissertation actually uses altruistic signifiers such as the fez to syncretize Islamic sects like the Moorish Science Temple, which I spotted on one of your slides, with Ottomanism and Islamic unity more broadly. How would you say a conceptualization such as this aligns with your presentation today and your intellectual work in general surrounding how you think we should think about the caliphate in a different manner?
Yeah, hi, my name is Mudassir. I am from Jisr, a Qatar-based think tank. And this is my question. There was a discussion on the practicality of caliphate, given that now we are living in a very different environment. The values on which distinctions are made among different groups are very different. We're talking about democracy, equality, those kind of things, and it's not really religious values which perhaps defined the geopolitical ecosystem in the medieval ages, which made perhaps the caliphate more feasible. But looking at the trends, especially in throughout the world, actually, but including even in the collective West, there is a move towards the far right. For example, in Europe, we are seeing almost everywhere move towards populist and far right. Even in the US, you see the election of Donald Trump. It's a sort of validation of the fact that people are moving towards their religious values, their conservative values. So given that this transition is happening, do you think that the atmosphere is perhaps a little more ripe than what it has been in the past century for a concept like caliphate to perhaps take fruition? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Taskeen Nissa. I'm from Kashmir and I'm pursuing bachelor's in international relations and political science. So my question to you is that there was a lot of discussion here about the greater Ummatic, all of the unity that the Ummah should have. And there's something that Allama Iqbal has said on this. He has said that the flags that the Muslim nations pertain right now, they are the neo-Buddhs, the neo-idols. But at the same time, he has also said that nationalism, if we know properly like how we can use it, we can build, we can create some sort of a greater Muslim a greater Muslim unity. So my question to you is that, is something like that possible? Like, if we don't go out there like nefariously, just go out there and strap and take all the separate identities of the people out of them. Like, I'm a Muslim first and then I'm a Kashmiri. Now, if someone comes tomorrow and says to me, no, you're only a Muslim. So that, in today's time, is literally not possible, and people won't accept it like that. So do you think that if we just go out there and respect that people, they come from different nationalities, they come from different races, if we respect those, if we build a more inclusive environment, we will be able to create that greater Muslim unity? Thank you.
Yeah, my question is directed to Professor Aydın. You said that the Prophet, peace be upon him, did not order his companions, the rightly guided caliphs, to establish a caliphate. Something, the meaning to that effect. But I want to recall the famous hadith in the book of Imam An-Nawawi, the 40 hadith, in which he said that, follow my sunnah and the sunnah of the Khulafa Rashidin and hold on to it, with your teeth. So the four caliphs, Prophet peace be upon him, was saying to his companions that their sunnah should be followed also. And they, as you said that they were not instructed to establish a caliphate, but which they eventually did. So I don't know if you want to reply to that.
Merhabalar, Mevlüt Kayabaşı, Aydın Didim'den katılıyorum. Ovamir Bey, Nurettin Zengi ve Selahattin Eyyubi'den bahsetti. İki aksiyoner isminde yaşadığı dönemde Kudüs fethi mücadelesinde en büyük engellerden bir tanesi halifenin kendisiydi. Aynı şeyin sonraki dönemlerde de Osmanlı'nın hilafeti temsilen almasına kadarki sürelerde yaşandığını biliyoruz. Osmanlı tebaası içerisinde hilafetin kaldırılması döneminde dahi Hint Müslümanları kadar ya da diğer bölgelerdeki İngilizlerden özellikle eziyet gören Müslümanlar kadar Türkler hilafetin kaldırılması aksiyon göstermemişlerdi. Bunun nedeni nedir? Bununla ilgili kanaatim doğru mudur, yanlış mıdır bilemiyorum ama böyle bir kanaatimiz var. Bir ikincisi, hocamızın bahsettiği gibi işbirliği kurumlarını dahi aksiyon almak ve politika üretmek noktasında kullanamayan Arap Ligi gibi, İslam Konferansı Örgütü gibi kurumları dahi örgütleyemeyen ve politik üretemeyen bir İslam dünyası hilafet makamı noktasında nasıl bir ortak nokta oluşturacak?
Maybe I combine a couple of questions. Maybe I start with Allama Iqbal. Of course, he's my hero. And I think what we see in Allama Iqbal is that he is a representative of the very productive, very humanist, very creative time in modern Islamic thought. Throughout history, we have Muslim scholars, but the most productive period was under colonialism, under racism, which was these problems gave them this universalism, and he actually formulated Islam as a humanist alternative to colonialism and racism. But he did not have a particular notion of a state, and it's not clear how you would do that. I think he wouldn't have predicted how nationalism will be very dominant. So what I see, what we might need to do, and our colleague's question about the fez and the symbols, is that Muslims in the late 19th, early 20th century obviously inherited, reinterpreted their tradition to create a universal global vision of both politics, philosophy, ethics in the 19th century. Because in that context, the Ottomans became a magical symbolic head, or even though they were not the creators. Once it's gone, it's very difficult to get back to that unitive spirit. Going back to our colleague's question, historians of Muslim political thought say that the theory of caliphate evolved over a period of 120 years, and not all Muslims agreed. I would like to highlight, please do not exclude Shia Muslims. Caliph Yazid killed Imam Hussein. Don't forget that moment. That's a big shock. And I will say, yes, we have all kinds of problems geopolitically. We need to solve them. And if you say that let's create caliphate, or let's find the real Mahdi and Imam, or I say, I'm grandson of Genghis Khan, I say it's Turks, let's create the real grandchild of Genghis Khan, who actually created a better world order than anything Europeans could have created, right? These are not going to solve our problems. These are actually escape from the problems. We should not escape. If we wait for the caliph to solve our problems, we will wait forever. And I think we should, I understand that the idea that if Muslims are believing more into their faith, it will be stronger, that we need that idealism. But if we channel that idealism to a theory of a medieval juridical theory of caliphate, we will destroy the political purpose of Muslim unity and liberation.
Okay, thank you.
So, real quick, I have only 2 minutes. The idea that we have to wait for the caliphate for the to liberate Palestine, right? I did not even suggest it from 1,000 miles away. In fact, what I argue is that the process of unification, which needs to have all these goals of a modern institutional design in which there is a reasoned distribution of power between local and global institutions, that's necessary. That's what, in my view, a caliphate, a modern caliphate, would look like. But if we do not claim, if you do not work for a good caliphate, you're going to get many bad ones, and you're going to get them every decade. Because, unlike Professor Aydın, I see in every Islamic work, so long as people are going back to Islam and not perhaps reading some book on good governance by a modern Rawls or something, if they are looking at Islam, they're going to believe. Imam al-Ghazali said, if you don't have a Khalifa, all your social relations, your marriage and your contracts, all are null and void. People really emphasize the caliphate, and this goes throughout. So if you're going to throw out al-Ghazali or Ibn Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah, and you're going to Abu Hanifa and Shafi'i, you will have to build up a new Islam. And I will doubt whether in that new Islam you can get away from it, from the caliphate, Islamic tradition. So that's, I'm not saying that, we need to wait for the caliphate, but rather working toward the caliphate. And as a believing Muslim, I say, when you do the right thing that God asks you to do, then God solves the problems. right? That's almost in every khutbah you hear that you don't always know. You go pray to God in the way God requires and not the way you choose. And in the process, you get benefits both in this world and the next. So I don't want to underemphasize that point. I know there are people who will deny the obligation of the caliphate, but that's a very modern phenomenon. And the claim that I'm making is that until the modern period, you don't have any major Muslim scholars known that are followed that deny that. And at the same time, I completely agree with the problem of sectarianism in the Shia. Is it possible for the Shia to also feel included in the caliphate? I believe it is. In fact, we are working in Ummatics with some Shia scholars as well. It is true that not everybody will agree, but nobody will agree. I am certain that less people will agree on the proposal that we need to work on some definition of equality and freedom instead of, among Muslims at least, rather than working on Islam, which brings together, most importantly, an afterlife and not merely utilitarian for this life. So if we don't have a good caliphate, I'm afraid you're going to get a bad caliphate, a bad claim to caliphate every few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for all participants and the panelists for this good debate on the caliphate issue. Okay,